Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are embarking on, well, a pretty massive intellectual journey, really. It spans over 2,000 years.
Yeah, it's huge. We're tracing this single continuous line of thought, this kind of spiritual architecture. It starts way back with classical Greek philosophy.
Then absolutely explodes onto the world stage with Alexander the Great.
Right. And then it solidifies in Byzantium, becoming the framework, the very definition of what civilization meant in the Mediterranean world for centuries.
Our mission today is to really get under the hood of this deep structure of thought. The sources we're drawing on call it the Byzantine Logos.
And this isn't just, theology or straightforward political history. It's about exploring how Greek identity, its philosophy, and this inherent drive for empire all evolved together.
How they culminated in the sacred framework of the Byzantine state.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to understand how Hellenism went from being, one culture among many to becoming the universal civilization, basically the philosophical operating system for that entire world.
And we're definitely going beyond just history here, getting into metaphysics, because this whole path, this whole story is defined by a fundamental intellectual conflict.
That's the core of it. We're diving into what the author calls the Noomachia, the War of the Mind, a battle that really shaped the soul of this civilization for hundreds, even thousands of years.
So, the Noomachia. To get a handle on that, we need to understand the two main poles, the two big ideas the Hellenic mind was constantly wrestling with.
Right. The first one is what's termed the Apollonian Dionysian Logos. Think vertical, patriarchal, transcendent order.
Okay, so like striving upwards. Intellectual purity, rationality, getting away from the messiness of the material world.
Precisely. It's that drive for ascent, for form, for clarity, separated from material confusion. Apollo and Dionysus representing different facets of that drive in this interpretation.
And the other pole, the one it's fighting against.
That's the Logos of Cybele. Cybele, the great mother goddess. This represents the opposite forces, chthonic, meaning earth-based, and horizontal.
So, grounded material.
Exactly. This logic champions materialism, raw physical sensation, staying within the bounds of the immanent world, and actively rejecting those abstract transcendent forms.
So the history of Hellenism and then Byzantium is basically this ongoing struggle, trying to keep that vertical Apollonian axis dominant.
That's the argument presented, yes. A persistent millennia-long effort to keep that transcendent focus strong against what's seen as the constant gravitational pull of Cybele's materialist logic. That fundamental tension is our key for today.
Okay, let's start where it really takes off. Alexander the Great.
Right, because his empire, in the kind of geopolitical cycle thinking that both Greeks and Judeans recognized at the time, represented the Third Kingdom, the brazen kingdom mentioned in prophecies.
And then Rome comes along, beats Carthage in the Third Punic War, and basically takes over that role, becomes the Fourth Kingdom.
It assumes the function of the universal kingdom, yes. It inherits that mantle of global authority previously held by the Hellenistic world, initiated by Alexander.
But here's the really interesting part, you argue. Rome wasn't ethnically Greek, not Hellenic.
Correct. But it became profoundly Hellenistic. The moment Rome takes charge, the empire's borders just merge seamlessly with the space already defined by Hellenism.
So it wasn't a conquest in the usual sense, where the conqueror imposes their culture?
Not really. It was more like a transfer of imperial function. And the incredible thing is the conquering power, Rome, almost completely submitted to the philosophical and cultural dominance of the people they conquered. Hellenism won the cultural war, you could say.
To understand Alexander's role in founding this whole universal system, we need to look at his origin story. It's pretty intense.
It really is. His birth is just saturated with this synthesis of the vertical, the divine, and the chthonic, the earth-based. His parents, Olympias and Philip, supposedly first met during the Samothracian mysteries.
The cult of the Kabiri, that's pretty deep esoteric stuff already.
Exactly. And Plutarch gives us these astonishing details connecting Alexander's lineage directly to those deep chthonic forces. His mother, Olympias, is said to have experienced Zeus appearing to her as a great serpent.
Wow. Okay.
And this isn't just some random dream. It directly mirrors the mythological birth of Dionysus Zegarus. He was also conceived when Zeus took the form of a serpent to visit Persephone, the queen of the underworld.
So there's a direct parallel being drawn to Dionysus.
A very explicit one. And Plutarch adds that Olympias's devotion to these earth-based orgiastic rites was, intense, almost barbaric,
Oh,
even by Greek standards at the time.
oh, so.
He describes her in processions carrying these enormous, live, tame snakes that apparently writhe out from under ivy leaves and sacred baskets, coiling around the wands the thirsty carried by the women.
That's quite an image, a very visceral connection to the Earth Mother, to Dionysian frenzy.
Absolutely. So Alexander's born under this powerful sign, this blend of the divine and the chthonic. But
Mhm.
his function right from the start elevates beyond that.
How do you mean?
Even as a child, the sources say he showed this unique combination of the warrior kingly function and the priestly philosophical function. He wasn't just one or the other.
Which fits perfectly with Plato's idea of the ideal ruler, right? The seventh type in his Politics.
Exactly, the philosopher king archetype, but actually walking around in human form.
And people at the time saw this. They recognized its significance.
According to the sources, yes. His contemporaries saw Alexander's emergence as this radical break, a reversal of recent history.
How so?
Since the Trojan War, Greek time had been seen as sort of winding down, a post-heroic time where the gods didn't really intervene directly anymore. Alexander's arrival felt like the return of the gods, restoring a kind of superhuman energy and meaning to history.
And Alexander himself believed this.
The sources, particularly Plutarch, claim he was utterly convinced of his divine descent, that he was the son of a god.
But he played it strategically.
Seems so. He apparently emphasized this divine connection more when dealing with non-Greeks, the Barbaroi. But among the Hellenes, the Greeks themselves, he was a bit more reserved about it.
It's almost like a tool for unifying a diverse empire.
Potentially. And to make this idea of divine presence more concrete, there's this vivid physical detail reported by Plutarch.
What's that?
He notes Alexander's appearance. His skin was apparently very bright, sometimes even flushed red on his chest and face. And more remarkably, his body and even his breath were said to give off a pleasant, sweet fragrance.
Like an aura.
In the ancient world, that was seen as a physiological sign of divine favor, something inherent that marked him as different from ordinary people.
Okay, so we have the divine birth, the presence. Let's talk about the mind, the intellectual side. His relationship with Aristotle.
Crucial. Alexander famously said he loved his teacher, Aristotle, no less than his father, Philip.
And he made a distinction.
A really important one. He said Philip gave him mere life, zoo, but Aristotle gave him the kaiozus, the beautiful life, the worthy life.
So, in a way, Aristotle was his intellectual father.
Yes, the interpretation offered, that in the sphere that knows the mind, Alexander was intellectually conceived and born through Aristotle's teaching.
And Philip recognized the value of this.
Immensely. He paid what the source calls a beautiful and worthy price for this education. When Aristotle's hometown, Stagira, was destroyed, Philip had it rebuilt and secured the return of all its citizens who'd been exiled or enslaved, all for Aristotle's teaching.
Wow, that's commitment. And this teaching wasn't just standard stuff, right? There was secret knowledge involved.
Yes, this is critical. Alexander was apparently initiated into the deepest levels, the aportoton kai bathun de deskalion, the forbidden and deep teaching.
What did that entail?
These were teachings described as oral, akromatikos, and hidden apoptikos, meaning they were reserved for those initiated into the mysteries, those who could achieve direct mystical insight, not just book learning.
And this led to conflict later.
It did. There's a famous story about Alexander writing an angry letter to Aristotle from his campaigns in Asia.
What was he angry about?
Aristotle had apparently published some of these secret doctrines. Alexander was furious. His argument was essentially geopolitical. Look, if the teachings that made us, the rulers, superior, become common knowledge, what distinguishes us from the masses anymore?
He wanted to maintain an edge based on knowledge, not just power.
Exactly. Supremacy through superior hidden wisdom.
And Aristotle's response.
It essentially confirmed the existence of this hidden layer. He replied, according to the story, that the teachings were published but not published,
Meaning
their true esoteric essence remained hidden, accessible only to those properly initiated. It implies that Aristotle's written texts were like codes, secretly preserving ancient, orally transmitted traditions. Just like Plato's dialogues are sometimes seen as hinting at deeper Pythagorean doctrines, you needed the key.
this divine dimension seems to follow him everywhere. What about during his conquest, like the siege of Tyre?
Absolutely. That siege was grueling, lasted 7 months, and it's framed by these divine interventions, or at least perceived interventions.
Like the dream.
Right. Plutarch records Alexander dreaming that the hero Heracles was reaching out to him from the city walls, beckoning him in.
A sign of divine support.
And at the same time, the people inside Tyre were panicking. They had dreams that their patron god, Apollo, was announcing he was going to defect to Alexander's side because he was disgusted with things happening in the city.
How did they react to their god wanting to leave?
They literally tied the colossal statue of Apollo to its pedestal with ropes, effectively putting their god under arrest and accusing him of being an Alexandrist.
Wow, trying to physically restrain a god.
It shows the desperation. And then there's the famous verbal mnemonic cue, the satyr dream.
Remind us of that one.
Alexander dreamt he caught a satyr after a long chase. His seers interpreted this as a pun. They split the Greek word satyr into satyros.
Meaning?
Tyre will be thine. Satyros. It was seen as a divine green light for the final assault.
And after he captured Tyre?
He symbolically freed the statue of Apollo, confirming the god's allegiance had shifted to him. Then came the journey to the Oracle of Amun in the Libyan desert.
The one identified with Zeus.
Correct. The high priest there famously proclaimed Alexander, son of Zeus, which allowed him to adopt the sacred title of the Egyptian pharaohs, a crucial step in legitimizing his rule there.
And wasn't there something about his father, Philip?
Yes. Significantly, the priest supposedly stopped Alexander from asking whether his father Philip's murderers had been punished. The reason given. Philip was not among the mortals anymore, meaning he was now divine, and thus beyond the reach of mortal justice or revenge. It confirmed Alexander's unique lineage from both sides.
So this divine aspect wasn't just personal belief, it was fundamental to the identity of Hellenism itself.
Absolutely essential. Alexander was seen as restoring the Megalochronia, the great times, proving that the barrier between the divine and human worlds could be broken again.
And you mentioned his role as kathekon earlier, the restrainer.
Yes. This wasn't just a passive title. He was seen as actively, metaphysically holding back the forces of chaos.
How so?
The sources mention this fascinating, perhaps symbolic story of Alexander building a copper or bronze wall at the Caspian Gates.
What was that for?
To prevent the mythical incursion of underground subhuman creatures, often associated with the Gog and Magog in later traditions. This act was interpreted eschatologically.
Like a historical echo of myths?
Precisely. Like the Titans being locked behind the Bronze Wall in Tartarus and Hesiod's cosmology. Alexander's empire, in this view, wasn't just a political entity. It was founded as a literal citadel of the gods, a metaphysical defense against the rising tide of chaos and materialism, the forces associated with the Logos of Cybele.
Okay, so Alexander sets the stage. What happens after he dies? The empire fragments.
Immediately, among the Diadochi, the successors, this is where we shift from the personal rule of the philosopher king to the longer-term kind of geopolitical algorithm of Hellenism.
What happens in Greece itself?
Well, Antipater, who Alexander had left in charge of Macedon, puts down the Lamian War, basically finishing Philip's project of unifying Greece under Macedonian control.
Yeah.
But then things get messy.
The usual power struggles.
Exactly. Cassander eventually seizes power, executes Alexander's mother Olympias, his wife Roxana, and his young son Alexander IV, wiping out the direct line. Eventually, Antigonus II Gonatas establishes the Antigonid dynasty, which holds Macedon until the Romans arrive.
But you said mainland Greece becomes secondary.
Strategically, yes. The real energy, the spiritual and political center of gravity, shifts outwards, to the periphery.
Where to?
To these dynamic new capitals, Antioch in Syria, Alexandria in Egypt, Pergamum in Anatolia, and increasingly even towards Italy and Rome itself. The original heartland of Hellenism, Greece proper, starts to lose its momentum, its clear sense of historical purpose.
Which creates an interesting situation with Rome rising.
A huge asymmetry. Rome, the new global power on the block, sees Macedon, representing that unified Greek power inherited from Alexander, as its main rival.
So Rome tries to weaken Macedon.
Cleverly, yes. Rome positions itself as the defender of the traditional Greek city-state system, the polis, supporting various Greek leagues and cities against the Macedonian kings, undermining from within.
And the final straw.
That comes when Philip V of Macedon makes an alliance with Carthage during the Punic Wars. That locks Macedon and Rome into being direct adversaries.
But the irony, as you mentioned, is the translatio imperia, the transfer of empire. Rome wins the wars.
Militarily, yes, but culturally, it's the opposite. Rome's victories don't bring some new Roman ideology or religion to the East. Instead, Roman legions, Roman administration, Roman culture itself becomes more and more Hellenized.
So the conquest just spreads Hellenism further.
Exactly. Roman power becomes the vehicle for broadcasting the Hellenistic logos across the entire Mediterranean and beyond.
Which points to the incredible intellectual achievement of this era, Hellenism becoming this universal metaphysics.
It's a fundamental transformation. Greek culture, the Greek language, Koine Greek, Greek ways of thinking, they stop being just the property of one ethnic group.
They become universal tools.
Precisely. They transform into the universal coin, not just a common language, but a shared paradigm-based system for philosophy, science, administration, everything. A system capable of translating and integrating vast knowledge from completely different civilizations, like Egypt or Persia.
So being Greek changed meaning.
Completely. It stopped being about your bloodline and became synonymous with being the measure of things, embodying the ideal of the perfected human. It became a universal identity, something non-Greeks aspired to and adopted, and it was embodied in the authority of those Hellenistic kings.
And this universalizing tendency affected religion, too.
Profoundly. It led directly to what the source calls the rise of meta-religion. Hellenistic religion becomes less about local devotional cults and much more philosophical.
How did that work?
It systematically took all the local cults, the various pantheons across the empire, and synthesized them, found the common denominators, fit them into a universal philosophical paradigm.
Even the gods themselves changed.
They were redefined. Figures like Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, Dionysus, and they weren't just the old pre-classical deities anymore. They were reinterpreted through a Platonic or Neoplatonic lens.
As what?
As Platonic ideas, or as fundamental ontological archetypes that govern logic, cosmology, ethics, they became objects of philosophical contemplation, integrated into a rational system. This is a massive metaphysical upgrade, something later Neoplatonists like Proclus would fully articulate in works like his Elements of Theology.
And this required blending different traditions, syncretism.
Intense religious syncretism, yes. Look at Ptolemaic Egypt. It was a deeply theocratic society, dominated by priests. Alexander had been smart visiting the Temple of Amun, asking to be buried near Memphis initially. That showed respect and opened the door.
So the Ptolemies needed a unified religion for their diverse kingdom.
Exactly. They needed something universal. So they commissioned an Eleusinian priest, Timotheus, to essentially create a new synthesized cult, the cult of Serapis and Isis.
And these figures absorbed others.
Massively. Isis was equated with practically every major goddess. Demeter, Aphrodite, Hera, Artemis, even the great mother Cybele herself. Serapis, who was linked to Osiris, was identified with Hades or Pluto, but also, crucially, widely recognized as a form of Dionysus. Herodotus and the Orphics had already noted that connection.
So they created a kind of greatest hits deity.
You could see it that way. It achieved what the source calls meta-religion achieved. As the scholar F. Zielinski noted, in Hellenistic religion, philosophy and religion basically fused. They became inseparable, creating this pantheos and all-god paradigm that could philosophically accommodate almost any spiritual path under one overarching framework.
And this Timotheus, the Eleusinian priest, he was involved elsewhere too.
Yes. Interestingly, he's also credited with establishing the Hellenistic version of the Great Mother cult up in the Pergamenian kingdom in northern Anatolia, which was ancient Phrygia.
What did he do there?
He systematically fused the Eleusinian Demeter, who he already linked with Isis down in Egypt, with the local Anatolian goddess Cybele.
Creating another synthesis.
Right. A more theoretical, philosophical version of the Great Mother religion. The source specifically terms this the Logos of Cybele. It represents a specific systematized facet within the larger, unified Hellenistic meta-religion.
So even the powerful, earthy Cybele cult had to be brought into the philosophical system.
It had to be understood and managed through the Greek philosophical lens, yes. It couldn't remain just raw, untamed force. It had to be given a logos.
So all these regional cults, Serapis and Isis in Egypt, the Pergamena Cybele, they were like branches of a single overarching spiritual algorithm for the whole Mediterranean.
That's the idea, a unified structure. And this structure absolutely solidified the concept of divine monarchy.
The kings becoming gods.
Fully embraced. The Attalids in Pergamum, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria, they all adopted the tradition of deifying monarchs. Ptolemy II, for instance, formally instituted the cult of his sister wife Arsinoe and deified his parents as the Theoi Satyras, the guides and saviors.
So the whole Hellenistic East becomes this realm ruled by divine kings.
It does, building directly on the precedent set by Alexander, who had decisively shattered that old wall between the human and the divine.
But this intellectual synthesis wasn't unchallenged, was it? This brings us back to the Noomachia, the war of the mind.
Exactly. It was forged in intellectual fire. We have to look at the main philosophical schools of the Hellenistic period, not just as abstract ideas, but as active expressions of these competing logoi, the Apollonian versus the Sabellian.
Let's start with the reaction against that vertical Apollonian trend, the chthonic reaction you called it, the voice of Cybele's logos.
Right, and that manifests primarily through two schools, the Cynics and the Epicureans.
The Cynics, the kouvikoi, dog philosophy, they came after Socrates.
Yes, but they took a radically different path from Plato. Thinkers like Antisthenes broke sharply away from the Apollonian direction Plato pursued.
How were they different?
Fundamentally anti-Platonic. They systematically rejected pretty much everything Plato stood for. The theory of eternal ideas, eidos, the concept of transcendence, the Eleatic philosophy of unchanging being, the whole ethics based on the abstract good.
So what did they believe in?
Only what you can sense, what you can touch. They were arguably the first comprehensive materialists in the Hellenistic world. Only sensible physical things exist.
And their famous motto, life according to nature.
Physis. But here's the twist. Because they rejected universal forms, eidos, nature for them meant only individual nature. There was no higher pattern to conform to. The Cynic had to follow only himself, his own impulses.
Which led to their unconventional lifestyle.
Modeled on the roaming dog, the Kunt. Reject property, sleep rough, eat whatever scraps you find, and completely reject all human social conventions, laws, institutions.
Diogenes of Sinope is the famous example.
The classic Cynic. His extreme asceticism wasn't about piety or spiritual growth. It was about demonstrating absolute contempt for society's opinions.
Like performing bodily functions in public.
Exactly. Eating, urinating, even masturbating publicly, performing the deeds of Demeter and Aphrodite openly, as the sources put it. It was a deliberate strategy to show contempt for artificial human laws, nomos, in favor of raw nature physis.
He also famously mocked Plato's abstract ideas.
Right. The story goes Plato was lecturing about abstract concepts like tableness and cupness, the universal forms. Diogenes supposedly interrupted, saying something like, Plato, I can see a table and a cup, but I sure don't see any tableness or cupness.
Pure empiricism.
And Plato's reported retort perfectly highlights the Apollonian counterargument, the need for a higher faculty. That makes sense, Diogenes. To see a table and a cup, you have eyes. But to see tableness and cupness, you lack a mind.
And this radical individualism of the Cynics led to
Diogenes defining himself as a citizen of the world, a cosmopolites. If you reject all local ties and institutions, the only identity left is universal humanity, a concept that would have a long and complex future.
Okay, so the Cynics represent one strand of this materialist reaction. What about the Epicureans?
They took the materialist argument to its logical, almost scientific extreme. Epicurus, who the Cynics actually admired, proposed a strictly materialist worldview that required, quite explicitly, the complete annihilation of myth and traditional religion.
Why was that necessary?
For Epicurus, the ultimate truth comes from sensation, aesthesis. Sensation is direct, irrational, and cannot be argued with. What causes sensation is real.
And the universe itself?
It's eternal, purely material, operates by fixed laws, like atoms swerving randomly, absolutely denies any kind of transcendence or divine intervention, and is based on strict immanentism summed up by the principle nothing comes from nothing. No creation, no outside forces.
But what's the connection between this physics and their goal of, say, happiness or pleasure?
This is the crucial link for understanding the Noomachia aspect. The ultimate goal for Epicurus was ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, mental tranquility, pure enjoyment. And to achieve that, you had to destroy myth.
Why? What was so disturbing about myth?
Primarily the fear of the gods and the fear of death and punishment in the afterlife. These fears, Epicurus argued, poisoned human life. Therefore, adopting a scientific materialist worldview that proved the gods weren't involved and death was final annihilation was philosophically necessary to defeat that existential horror and allow for pure enjoyment.
So materialism wasn't just a theory, it was a kind of therapy.
Exactly. A tool to achieve peace of mind. And the sources we're using explicitly frame this Epicurean project in stark mythological terms.
As what?
As a declaration of the Titans' revolt against the Olympian gods, as earth rising against heaven, as a gynecocracy ruled by the feminine material principle challenging androcracy, the rule of the masculine formal principle. It's presented as the full, systematic philosophical expression of the logos of Cybele within the Hellenistic intellectual battleground.
Okay, so that's the Sabellian side. What about the philosophy that tried to synthesize or find a middle ground, the one that eventually won out in the imperial era? Stoicism.
Right. Stoicism represents, in this framework, the immanent logos, or perhaps a kind of Dionysus's synthesis, integrating opposing forces within a structured whole, but keeping the emphasis on reason and order.
Who are its key figures?
Founded by Zeno of Citium, he drew heavily on Heraclitus, especially the concept of the logos, and also on a refined logical version of Aristotle.
What was their aim?
The Stoic school aimed to build a philosophy that reflected what the source calls a purified logos of Dionysus. Reality for them was dialectical. It inherently contained two poles that worked together, like Heraclitus's famous idea of an antiodromia, the path up and the path down being one and the same. Opposition creates harmony.
And their central concept was the logos.
Absolutely central. Borrowed from Heraclitus, it means the immanent rational order of the entire cosmos. It's universal, and importantly, it's something you can empirically grasp and understand through reason.
How does one access this logos?
The Stoic wise man finds the logos not by looking outside, but by turning inward, by examining his own reason. Reaching the hegemonikon, the governing principle of his own soul, he connects with the universal logos that structures everything. He ascends to the singular immanent divinity that permeates the cosmos.
It seems very orderly, active.
Extremely. And that active, rigorous focus on logic, cosmic unity, duty, and rational hierarchy made Stoicism the perfect imperial ideology for Rome. It just fit the Roman spirit of order, law, and empire building.
Who brought it to Rome?
Primarily the figures of the Middle Stoa, like Panetius and Posidonius. They adapted it for Roman sensibilities. And later it was embraced by key figures who defined the empire, like the philosopher Seneca, the former slave Epictetus, and perhaps most famously, the emperor Marcus Aurelius himself.
To understand the political side of this, we need to look at Polybius, right? The historian who watched Rome rise.
Yes, Polybius is crucial. A Greek historian, active during Rome's ascent, deeply influenced by Aristotle and the Stoic worldview, he looked at history with this sense of holism. He saw history not just as a sequence of events, but as a complete holistic structure, a syntoma, like a single organism. And understanding it required seeing it as a Dionysian combination of extremes, of opposing forces working together.
So studying history was a philosophical act.
For Polybius, absolutely. The goal was to study the confusing development building, all the individual events, battles, treaties, in order to discover the underlying one, the unity, the pattern, the meaning of history as a whole, to see the whole, kathotuon.
And he applied this to governments. He refined Aristotle's types of government.
Yes, giving us the famous 6 forms of government and the theory of the cycle of degradation, the anarchy-klosis.
Let's walk through that cycle again.
Okay. According to Polybius, it starts naturally with a simple, spontaneous monarchy, maybe a strong leader emerging. If it's ordered and just, it becomes basileia, true kingship, ruling by law and for the common good.
But that degrades.
Inevitably into its perverted form, tyranny, where the ruler acts selfishly. The excesses of tyranny provoke a reaction from the best citizens, leading to aristocracy rule by the best.
Which also degrades.
Into oligarchy rule by the wealthy few, the perversion of aristocracy. Then, the people react against the oligarchs, leading to democracy, or politia in Aristotle's terms, rule by the many under law.
And the final stage.
The chaotic endpoint. Ochlocracy. Here's the verbal algorithm cue. What is ochlocracy? It's the rule of the rabble, the ochlos.
What does that look like?
It happens when mass greed and envy take over, often fueled by demagogues promising handouts. Society breaks down into lawlessness, factional violence, disregard for property, demands for land redistribution, basically mob rule and chaos.
And this is the bottom of the cycle.
The absolute bottom. And Polybius makes this crucial eschatological point. When things get this bad, when ochlocracy leads to complete chaos and savagery, society essentially hits rock bottom.
And then?
It's forced to find a new strong leader, a monarch or autocrat, someone who can impose order just to survive. And then the cycle restarts with the reestablishment of sacred basileia, kingship. It's seen as an inevitable political algorithm.
But could this cycle be broken or managed?
Polybius thought so. He pointed to Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver of Sparta. Lycurgus supposedly foresaw this inevitable cycle and deliberately created the Spartan mixed constitution.
How did that work?
It blended elements of monarchy, the 2 kings, aristocracy, the Gerousia or Council of Elders, and democracy, the ephors and the assembly, into one system. The goal was to create checks and balances, to ensure uniform oscillation and equilibrium, like a well-trimmed ship that can sail steadily even against strong winds.
And Rome achieved something similar.
Polybius believed Rome had achieved this kind of stable, mixed constitution, not through a single philosophical plan like Lycurgus, but through centuries of pragmatic struggle, trial and error learning through pragmata, through hard experience, war, and changing fortunes.
And this analysis led him to predict the future.
Clearly, it led him to formulate the concept of the translatio imperii. He saw that the fragmented Hellenistic kingdoms of his time were no longer capable of maintaining universal unity. He predicted that the imperial mission, the mandate to unify the civilized world, would inevitably transfer from the Greeks to the rising power of Rome.
And this became Roman ideology.
It laid the foundation. The idea that Rome wasn't just another conquering power, but was fulfilling a historical destiny, countering the fatal political cycle by establishing an eternal empire, a divine alternative. This became core ideology for figures like Caesar and Augustus as they built the Roman Empire.
So we have this unified, philosophically sophisticated Hellenistic Roman Empire. The stage is perfectly set for the next major development.
The incursion of Christ, as the source terms it. And Christianity arises fundamentally within this Hellenistic environment. It speaks its language.
Koine Greek, the common tongue of the whole oikoumene, the civilized world.
Exactly. All the New Testament texts are composed in Greek. The target audience is the Hellenistic world. Even intellectual elites among the Judeans, like Philo of Alexandria, often operated primarily in Greek, reportedly not even knowing Hebrew well. Hellenism was the universal code.
So when St. Paul uses that radical phrase, neither Jew nor Greek,
Found in Colossians 3:11, yes. The implication, according to this interpretation, is that the ideal Christian subject is the Hellenist, not in an ethnic sense, but as the carrier of that universal world paradigm, stripped of specific ethnic ties, but retaining the universal philosophical framework established by Hellenism.
And Christianity quickly claimed more than just being another part of this world.
It claimed to be the eschatological climax. It didn't just join the conversation, it absorbed and declared itself the ultimate culmination of all Hellenistic hopes and eschatological ideas, including things like Virgil's Roman imperial prophecies.
It claimed to be the final truth.
The sole and highest form of Hellenistic truth. The ultimate palingenesis, the rebirth and fulfillment of Greek wisdom itself. The final realization of that vertical Apollonian axis they had sought for centuries.
But it had to define itself against that existing tradition, right? Philosophically.
Absolutely. Which led to the crucial apologetic strategy pioneered by figures like Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. He's often called the first Christian philosopher.
What was his approach?
Justin directly engaged with the peak of Hellenic Apollonian thought, which was Platonism, and sought to relate it directly to Christian doctrine. His key tool was the concept of the logos.
How did he use the logos?
He made this incredibly bold argument, the logos parity argument. He essentially said to the pagan philosophers, look, when we Christians talk about Christ the Logos, the firstborn Son of God, who was incarnated, crucified, died, resurrected, ascended, we're introducing nothing different from what you yourselves say about the so-called sons of Zeus. He drew direct parallels.
He was equating Christ with the philosophical logos.
Precisely. He argued that the logos, the word or reason that structures reality, was the chosen vessel for God's natural revelation throughout history. Therefore, the great Hellenic philosophers Socrates, Plato, Heraclitus, the best of the Apollonian tradition, were effectively Christians before Christ.
Because they revered the word.
Because they revered and sought the word, the logos, even though they only saw fragments of its light and hadn't witnessed its full incarnation in Jesus Christ. It was a brilliant strategy to claim the philosophical high ground.
But it wasn't a perfect fit, was it? St. Paul himself noted some tension.
A fundamental divergence, yes. Paul recognized it clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He lays out the dilemma.
What's the division?
He says, Jews demand signs, they seek miracles, demonstrations of divine power, the autonomous, and Greeks seek wisdom. They look for philosophical coherence, divine wisdom, theosophia.
Two different approaches to truth.
And the core Christian message, the proclamation of a crucified Christ, a suffering Messiah, seems to fail both tests. It's a stumbling block, an offense to Jews expecting a conquering king, and it's sheer folly, muria, foolishness, to Greeks seeking elegant philosophical arguments.
But Paul says there's a resolution.
For those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ becomes the synthesis. He is revealed as both God's power and God's wisdom.
So Christianity bridges that gap.
It claims to. But deep kinship remains evident. You can't fully explain the identity of Christ without understanding the sacred history of Israel, the dynamis aspect. And you can't fully grasp the concept of the logos, the Sophia aspect, without first understanding philosophy as the Hellenes understood it. The two are intertwined in the Christian claim.
This need for philosophical synthesis really comes to a head in Alexandria, doesn't it? With Origen.
Yes, Origen, working in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, is pivotal. He solidified Christian Platonism, creating a comprehensive system.
What were his key ideas?
Origen offered a complete cosmic teleology. He taught that the true meaning of any event, any created thing, lies in its beginning, archaia, and its end, hetelos. And ultimately, these coincide in eternity, within the Word, the wisdom of God, the Logos.
So the world itself is like a message?
Exactly. The world is a divine utterance, a text that simultaneously reveals God to those who can read it rightly and hides God from the unwise. The purpose of life, then, is ascent.
How does that ascent happen?
Through careful observation of nature, through philosophical work, concentrating meaning. But the absolute apex, the final key, is divine revelation, and specifically the incarnation of God, the Word, Jesus Christ. That's where the meaning becomes fully manifest.
He also had that controversial idea about universal restoration, apokatastasis.
Hugely controversial, yes, but very revealing of the Greek philosophical impulse within his thought, apokatastasis, the great restoration.
What it proposed?
Origen argued, based on logic and the nature of God, that everything that has a beginning must necessarily have an end. This led him to conclude that even the torments of hell could not be infinite.
Why not?
Because God is fundamentally good, and eternity belongs only to the good. Therefore, anything not good, like evil, suffering, punishment, must be temporary. Logic and divine goodness demanded, for Origen, that all souls, all beings, even fallen angels and demons, must eventually complete the path of return at the epistrophe and be restored to unity with God.
That sounds incredibly optimistic, but also very systematic, very Greek in a way.
It reflects that profound Greek philosophical desire for a closed, rational, ultimately harmonious system. Even salvation had to fit a logical pattern.
Origen also made a distinction within the Gospels himself.
Yes, he distinguished between the physical gospel, the literal stories, the historical events which he saw, much like the Old Testament law, as a necessary but temporary shadow of future blessings.
And the higher level.
That was the eternal gospel, which he primarily associated with the Gospel of John. This is the spiritual gospel, the realm where the wise mind, the nous, penetrates beyond the literal text and translates everything into pure spiritual meaning, into pure nous, contemplating the eternal truth before the Son of God.
So the path to wisdom involves moving from the physical to the spiritual, the literal to the allegorical.
Exactly. Extracting the eternal form, the meaning, from the bodily fabric of the world and the text, preparing the mind for its vertical ascent back to the source. That's classic Platonic structure applied to Christian scripture.
Okay, the philosophical groundwork is laid by figures like Justin and Origen, but for this to become the Byzantine logos, it needed political and institutional backing.
Absolutely. The philosophical ideas needed an empire to embody them. And the pivotal turn, undeniably, comes with Constantine the Great in the early 4th century.
His conversion, the Edict of Milan.
The Edict of Milan in 313 AD grants crucial religious freedom. Then, step by step, Christianity becomes privileged, essentially the official state religion by around 321 AD. And then the massive symbolic and strategic move, founding Constantinople, the new Rome, as a Christian capital, inaugurated in 330 AD.
And the Council of Nicaea.
Held in 325 AD. This council formalized the symbol of faith, the Nicene Creed. This was the culmination of 3 centuries of intense apologetic struggle, defining the divine nature of Christ against challenges like Arianism. It secured that vertical divine axis within Christian doctrine.
Who helped Constantine articulate the ideology for this new Christian empire?
His chief advisor, Eusebius of Caesarea. He was the one who really formulated the principles of the Christian empire, the Monarchia Christiana.
And what was the emperor's role in this vision?
Eusebius declared the emperor is apostolos, meaning equal to the apostles.
Equal to the apostles. That's a huge claim. Where did his power come from?
Directly from Christ himself, according to Eusebius. Just as Christ receives his authority directly from God the Father, the Christian emperor receives his mandate directly from Christ.
That raises a question, doesn't it? If the emperor is getting power directly from Christ, doesn't that blur the lines between spiritual and temporal authority? Something Plato himself seemed wary of, even when idealizing the philosopher king.
It's a central tension, and it highlights a key difference between East and West. Western Christian thought, especially following Augustine of Hippo, tended to emphasize an inherent, almost irreconcilable struggle between the city of God, the church, the clergy, the spiritual realm, and the earthly city, the state, secular rulers, the temporal realm.
2 separate spheres, often in conflict.
Yes. But Byzantium fundamentally rejected that dualism. It aimed for, and largely believed it achieved, a harmonious synthesis, a symphonia between church and empire.
How did they see that relationship?
The eternal acts through the temporal. The sacred manifests within the political structure. This led to a unique understanding, what the source calls a cathechonic ontology of the empire.
Cathechonic, relating to the cathechon, the restrainer.
Exactly. The Christian empire itself, the actual physical political state, was seen as having a crucial spiritual function. It was the cathechon.
So the emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was actively holding back evil.
That was the core belief. The emperor, as the cathechon, was holding back the forces of chaos, the devil, the coming of the Antichrist, the breakdown of order, essentially those chthonic powers that Alexander was seen as initially containing.
So the empire's existence was necessary for salvation.
The belief was that as long as the Christian Roman Empire, Byzantium, existed, led by the Orthodox emperor, the devil was restrained, held in check. Therefore, the conditions for individual salvation were more favorable within the empire because Christians were protected from worldly enemies, both physical and spiritual, the wiles of the devil. The state itself took on an almost liturgical function.
That's a powerful ideology, but how did they maintain the spiritual purity of this ideal, especially as the empire became vast and Christianity became the religion of the masses?
That's where monasticism becomes absolutely crucial. As the church grew huge, inevitably incorporating many people who were Christian more out of conformity than deep conviction. A situation managed by the principle of oikomia, or lenient dispensation for the masses, the original spiritual intensity risked getting diluted.
So monasticism was the counterbalance.
Precisely. Founded by figures like Pachomius the Great in Egypt, the monastic movement represented the pursuit of akrobeia, meaning strictness, precision, exact adherence to the spiritual ideal, as opposed to the necessary leniency, oikonomia, applied to the general population.
Can we visualize that contrast?
Think of it like this. Oikonomia was needed for the everyday reality of the empire. You couldn't expect every farmer or soldier who converted to maintain the intense fasting schedule or confession practices of the early church. That required pastoral flexibility. Akrobeia, practiced by the monks who deliberately withdrew from worldly affairs, was the rigorous, focused, almost Platonic pursuit of perfection, forming a kind of city within the city.
And this monastic community had a specific model.
It was explicitly seen by many, including perhaps the monks themselves, as the realization of Plato's ideal state, the Platonopolis, the Republic of Philosophers.
The monks as the philosopher guardians.
In a sense, yes. They were separate from the official clerical hierarchy, bishops, priests, and focused primarily on the individual soul's journey towards perfection, towards theosis deification, by grace, becoming like God. They were seen as the spiritual guardians of the empire, in that Platonic sense, anchoring the entire system to the vertical spiritual axis.
So the formula for the sacred society became
Monasticism plus empire, sacred empire. The two needed each other to fulfill the cathechonic function.
To really grasp the deep philosophical grammar underpinning all this, we need to look at Neoplatonism's final flourishing, particularly with Plotinus.
Yes, Plotinus in the 3rd century AD represents the absolute peak of pagan Hellenic philosophy. His system was consciously designed, the source argues, to overcome the pervasive sense of God-forsakenness, the spiritual crisis that had gripped the late classical world.
How did he structure reality? Through the hypostases.
Right. He presented reality as emanating from a single source in 3 primary hypostases, 3 fundamental levels of being. Let's visualize this vertically.
Okay, top down.
At the absolute summit, beyond all description, is the one, or the good, to agathon. It's utterly simple, transcendent, beyond being itself. You can only approach it apophatically by saying what it is not.
The first step down.
Is nous, usually translated as intellect or mind. This is the first emanation from the one, and this is where the source highlights what it calls transcendent Dionysianism.
What does that mean?
The life of nous is described as inherently ecstatic. It's eternally contemplating the one, and that contemplation is like being intoxicated, ravaged by the sheer intensity of the good. It's a purely intellectual ecstasy.
But it also has clarity.
Yes. When nous turns its attention inward, upon itself, it becomes sober. It achieves perfect self-knowledge, the identity of the thinker and the thought. It contains the archetypes, the Platonic forms of all things.
And the third level.
That's psyche, the world soul. This is the third act in the emanation, described as a rush of intelligent life downward from nous.
Is soul less perfect than mind?
In Plotinus' system, yes. It's less unified, less purely intellectual. Its primary object of ecstatic love is nous, the level above it. The relationship here mirrors the higher one. Soul, representing life, multiplicity, immanent Dionysianism, relates ecstatically to nous, representing mind, form, Apollonian sobriety. It's the same dynamic, just played out on a lower, more dispersed plane, closer to the material world.
And what about matter itself? Heil, where does that fit in?
This is absolutely crucial for understanding the Neoplatonic and later Byzantine emphasis on the vertical axis. For Plotinus, matter, Heil, stands at the very bottom of the hierarchy. It's the absolute antithesis of the one good.
So matter is evil.
It's not exactly an active force of evil in the Manichaean sense, but it's the principle of non-being, of deficiency, of formlessness. It's the ultimate source of limitation, corruption, and death. Everything that becomes fully immersed in matter, according to Plotinus, ultimately perishes because it loses its connection to the higher principles of form and life.
How is this visualized? Is there an image for this danger of matter?
Plotinus' student, Porphyry, provided a famous allegorical interpretation of Homer's Cave of the Nymphs in the Odyssey. It became a standard Neoplatonic image.
What did the cave represent?
The material cosmos itself. The dark, shadowy realm where celestial souls descend from the intelligible world above.
How did they get in?
Porphyry describes souls composed of light, fiery celestial elements entering this lower bodily cosmos through the gate of the north, associated with the dim constellation Cancer and the summer solstice, which he calls the Janua Inferni, the lower gates, the gates of generation into the material world.
And what draws them down? What's the temptation?
The temptation, according to Porphyry, is honey.
Honey. Why honey?
He uses honey as a powerful symbol for the sweetness of corporeal pleasure, the intoxicating allure of the physical body, which leads to forgetfulness of the soul's true origin and ultimately to spiritual death.
And Porphyry connects this honey explicitly to
the cult of the Great Mother Cybele, or Demeter, and specifically to bees, which were sacred to her priestesses. He draws a direct link between this honey intoxication, associated with the feminine, chthonic, material principle, gynecocracy, and the soul becoming trapped in matter.
And he contrasts this with
the masculine vertical ecstasy induced by Dionysian wine. Wine, in this interpretation, leads upwards towards sobriety, prophetic vision, and remembrance of the divine. Honey pulls downwards into forgetfulness and the body.
So the goal for the enlightened soul is
sobriety, recovering memory, escaping the cave of material existence, which Porphyry describes in stark terms as a damp, congealed hallucination, created by a mind weakened and clouded by its descent into matter.
This whole philosophical system, with its strong vertical emphasis and suspicion of matter, was then absorbed into Christian thought.
Massively influential. Even the brief attempt by the Emperor Julian the Apostate in the 360s AD to restore paganism wasn't a return to old Roman folk religion. His project was entirely based on high Neoplatonic philosophy. It confirmed that Hellenic philosophy, particularly Platonism, was really the only serious intellectual game in town by that point.
And the key figures who synthesized this with Christian dogma were the Cappadocian Fathers.
Yes. Basil the Great, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. Working in the late 4th century, they were absolutely crucial in finalizing the Orthodox understanding of the Trinity, particularly against the ongoing challenge of Arianism. Their work was ratified at the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 381 AD.
Why was defeating Arianism so philosophically important for this vertical structure?
Arianism, in its various forms, suggested that Christ, the Son or Logos, was similar in substance, homoousios, to the Father, but not the exact same substance, homoousios. This meant the Son was, in some sense, a created being, subordinate, perhaps the first and greatest creation, but not co-eternal and co-equal God.
What would be the consequence of that?
It would shatter the vertical Apollonian axis as understood by Christian Platonists. It would introduce an ontological gap, a fundamental break, between the ultimate Godhead, the Father, and the Logos through whom the world was created and redeemed. If the Logos isn't fully God, the bridge between God and creation is weakened, potentially broken.
So asserting the homoousios, that the Son is of the same substance as the Father, was essential.
Absolutely essential for maintaining the integrity of the vertical chain of being. The Cappadocians rigorously defended the Nicene formulation. This ensured the absolute, eternal divinity of the Son Logos, upholding the ontological priority of the transcendent mind over all created things, including matter.
And Nietzsche's comment about Christianity being Platonism for the masses.
It fits here. The success of Orthodox Christianity, particularly the Trinitarian and Christological dogmas hammered out by the Cappadocians, effectively cemented that Platonic vertical axis deep within the consciousness of the entire civilization. It demanded the subordination of the lower, earthly material, to the higher, heavenly, spiritual.
And the doctrine of Christ's two natures, fully God and fully human.
That also played a key role. It affirmed the immense dignity of human nature capable of being united with God himself without confusion or change, while simultaneously maintaining the ultimate hierarchy, the primacy of the divine logos.
Did the Cappadocians adopt the Neoplatonic view of the soul?
They adopted the basic structure, body, soul, spirit, or mind, nous, but with a crucial modification. They rejected the Origenist and Platinian idea that the soul existed before the body and then descended into it.
What was the Orthodox view?
That the soul is created together with the body by God at conception. It's a gift, not a fallen entity entering a prison. This maintained the structure of ascent needed for salvation, but aligned the ontology of creation more closely with the biblical narrative than with pure Neoplatonism.
And the final piece of this integration of Neoplatonism into the Christian worldview?
That comes later, probably around the 5th or 6th century, with the writings attributed to Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite.
What did he contribute?
He provided a systematic and highly influential description of the celestial hierarchy, the orders of angels. He organized them into 3 triads, 9 ranks in total.
Like seraphim, cherubim, thrones.
Exactly. Then dominions, powers, authorities, and finally principalities, archangels, angels. This wasn't just a list. It was presented as a detailed intellectual and spiritual structure.
What was its function?
It fully integrated the Neoplatonic model of hierarchical emanations directly into the Christian cosmos. These angelic orders were positioned as mediators, an intellectual and ontological bridge between the utterly unknowable apophatic God, as Dionysius describes him in his mystical theology, and the created human world below. It completed the Christianization of the Neoplatonic vertical structure.
So this Byzantine logos, forged through centuries of synthesis and conflict, created a unique kind of civilization.
Very unique. Because the unity wasn't just political or cultural, it was visceral, deeply religious. Serving the emperor in the Byzantine Empire wasn't just a civic duty, it was a religious obligation.
How did that affect social structures, like compared to Western Europe?
The profound sacrality of the emperor's authority, seen as deriving directly from God and essential for restraining evil, prevented the development of feudalism as it arose in the West.
Why? What's the difference?
Western feudalism was based more on personal oaths, contracts, reciprocal obligations between lords and vassals, a hierarchy, yes, but a somewhat conditional, contractual one. In Byzantium, the hierarchy was fundamentally sacred, flowing downwards from God through the emperor. Loyalty wasn't primarily contractual. It was a matter of participating in the empire's divine cathechonic mission. This unified belief system bound the society together in what felt like a continuous imperial liturgical service.
You also mention a key difference in how Byzantium handled the feminine principle compared to the West.
Yes, the source argues this is crucial. Unlike the West, where the Xonic forces often associated with the feminine or the logos of Cybele faced increasing suspicion and repression, think of the later witch hunts, for example, Byzantium found a way to integrate the feminine principle constructively, primarily through the profound veneration of Sophia, holy wisdom, often personified as feminine, and of course the Theotokos, Mary the Mother of God. The feminine wasn't eliminated or repressed, it was transfigured.
Integrated into the higher structure?
Yes, integrated into the contemplative, rational structure of the nous, the mind. The source suggests this successful spiritual integration prevented the kind of explosive backlash of the repressed feminine material principle that occurred later in the West during revolutionary periods.
Like the cult of the goddess of reason during the French Revolution.
Exactly. That's presented as a prime example of the violent return of the suppressed Cybele force in a purely materialist gynecocratic form. Byzantium, through its synthesis, achieved a more stable, integrated verticality that incorporated rather than just rejected the feminine.
But Byzantium eventually fell. Constantinople, 1453. What happens to this logos then?
It marks the final phase, in this view, of the translatio imperii, the transfer of the imperial function. The Ottoman sultans who conquered Constantinople saw themselves not just as Turkish rulers, but as successors to 3 imperial traditions.
Which words?
Their own Turkic heritage, the legacy of the Islamic Caliphate, and crucially the Roman-Byzantine imperial tradition. Mehmed the Conqueror explicitly saw himself as the new Roman emperor.
And did the Greeks just resist, or was there cooperation?
It was complex. There was significant Greek collaboration with the Ottomans. This wasn't always just opportunism. For some, it was a strategic choice,
Why would they collaborate?
particularly after the trauma of 1204,
Oh.
when the Western Catholic Crusaders sacked Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. That event created deep bitterness and distrust towards the Latin West. Venice, Genoa, the papacy. For many Greeks, the perceived economic exploitation and religious intolerance of the Latins made Turkish rule seem like the lesser of two evils. The Ottomans, initially at least, allowed the Orthodox Church considerable autonomy under the Millet system.
So there was a history there.
A strong Turkophile element existed within the Byzantine elite, as scholars like Dimitris Kitsikis have detailed. We see this institutionalized later with the Phanariots, the powerful Greek families living in the Phanar district of Constantinople, who administered the Orthodox community and often held high positions in the Ottoman government, extending the Sultan's influence through the Orthodox world.
And there are examples of individuals crossing over.
Yes, the source mentions the story, perhaps partly legendary but indicative, of Zaganos Pasha, supposedly a Greek nodal who converted to Islam, became one of Mehmed II's most trusted generals, and played a key role in the conquest and rebuilding of Constantinople. It highlights how quickly the old ethno-religious elite structures could morph into a multi-ethnic, centralized imperial aristocracy under the Ottomans.
This idea of a shared imperial destiny, even between conqueror and conquered, shows up in mythology too. The Marble King and the Red Apple.
Absolutely. This is a fascinating example of shared eschatology, a shared symbolic landscape. They were fighting over the same prize, using overlapping symbols.
Remind us of the Greek legend of
The legend of the Marmaromanos Basileus, the Marble King. It holds that the last Orthodox emperor, Constantine CF Paleologos, though the source mentions Constantine the Axe, it's usually a cause associated with the fall, didn't actually die in the final battle. Instead, he was saved by an angel, turned into marble, and hidden in a secret cave near the Golden Gate of Constantinople.
and he's waiting to return.
Yes. He awaits the day when he will resurrect, take up his sword, and drive the Turks out of the city and back to the Kukinamolia, the red apple tree, symbolizing the mythical original homeland of the Turks, far away in the east. It's a prophecy of restoration.
And the Turkish legend.
The Ottomans had their own powerful prophecies. Mehmed the Conqueror was apparently well aware of sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad predicting the conquest of Constantinople and suggesting the conqueror might even be the Mahdi, the Islamic Messiah. For the Turks, Constantinople itself became known as the Kizil Elma, the Red Apple.
The same symbol, the red apple.
The very same symbol. It represented the ultimate imperial prize, the center of the world, the golden orb of sovereignty.
Where did that connection come from?
It might relate to the legend of the huge golden orb held by the ancient statue of Justinian the Great on horseback, which stood near Hagia Sophia. That orb was sometimes called the golden apple, or red apple, by the Byzantines themselves. When it reportedly fell from the statue's hand sometime in the 14th or 15th century, it was seen as a terrible omen that the Greeks would lose the city, lose the apple of empire.
So both Greeks and Turks were fighting for control of the same symbolic center, the red apple, representing world dominion.
Exactly. Struggling for supremacy within the same continuous civilizational arena, using the same core imperial symbols, even if interpreting them differently.
And this Marble King prophecy, it remained potent.
Immensely so. It
Right.
saw a huge revival of popularity during the Russo-Turkish Wars of the 18th century, particularly the one from 1768-1774. Because the Orthodox Russians, fighting the Ottomans, were often identified by Greeks as the Xanthonginos, the fair-haired race, mentioned in some versions of the prophecy, the ones destined to come from the north and liberate Constantinople, allowing the Marble King to return.
This ties into the work of Cosmas the Aetolian.
Yes, St. Cosmas the Aetolian, an 18th century monk and preacher, traveled tirelessly throughout Ottoman-ruled Greece. His mission was the spiritual and educational revival of the Greek nation, the Genos.
What was his message?
He constantly stressed that the desired liberation to Pathomenon, the longed-for thing, wasn't just a matter of politics or waiting for foreign intervention. It depended absolutely on the Greeks themselves, returning to their deep Byzantine Orthodox Christian roots, strengthening their faith and education. They had to prepare themselves spiritually for the eventual restoration of the empire, ensuring the vertical axis was strong before any political change could be lasting or meaningful.
So looking back over this vast sweep of history from Alexander to the Ottoman era, the core theme is this continuous effort to uphold the Byzantine logos.
That's the central argument presented. The Byzantine logos represents the outcome of this exhaustive cultural and spiritual synthesis. the universalization of Hellenism, its purification through philosophical struggle, its final transfiguration by Christianity, all aimed at securing that vertical, transcendent axis against the constant pull of materialism, immanentism, and the chthonic chaos associated with the logos of Cybele. It was a millennium-long defense of that structure.
But the ultimate irony, looking at modern history,
Is profound. When Greece finally achieved national independence in the 19th century, creating the modern Greek state, it did so largely by embracing the dominant ideologies of the European modern project.
which were
Secularism, nationalism, Enlightenment rationalism, often leaning towards materialism, essentially. The very philosophical currents that originated in the West, partly as a rejection of the integrated, hierarchical, sacred worldview that Byzantium represented.
So modern Greece, in trying to rejoin Europe, had to adopt the philosophies its Byzantine ancestors fought against.
That's the paradox highlighted. It required embracing the very principles, the horizontal, the secular, the material focus that the entire Byzantine project under the banner of the Cappadocian had spent over 1,000 years resisting in favor of the vertical transcendent logos.
So this whole deep dive really leaves us with a final provocative question, doesn't it? Stemming from those ancient masters, Plato, Plotinus.
It does. If the greatest philosophical minds of that entire tradition, the very architects of the Byzantine logos, consistently taught that the physical world, the world of the senses, is ultimately just a pale reflection, maybe even an inferior hallucination, created by a soul that's weakened, forgetful, and lost its connection to the higher realms of mind.
Then you have to ask, how much of our own contemporary reality, deeply rooted as it is in scientific materialism, is just that damp, congealed hallucination, as Porphyry put it, of an unenthused mind, a mind that has forgotten its inherent vertical capacity.
Could the true reality still be that world of eternal ideas, of dreams, of spiritual ascent, accessible only to the soul that achieves sobriety, remembers its source, and undertakes that ecstatic upward journey of the nous? That's the challenge the Byzantine logos leaves us with. Type continue for further detail.
Continue.
Okay. To adhere strictly to the mandate for maximum detail, let's elaborate further on the specific phases of Hellenistic history as delineated in the source material. Understanding this periodization helps grasp the momentum.
Right, you mentioned 3 phases earlier.
Yes. The first phase, considered foundational, is Alexander's own lifetime and the immediate creation of his empire. Roughly 336 BC when he takes the throne, down to about 280 BC, covering the initial wars of his successors. This establishes the Third Kingdom template, the universal empire ideal.
Phase 2
runs from about 280 BC to 220 BC. This is the high period of the Diadochi kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, the Antigonids in Macedon. They exist in a kind of dynamic, often warring, but relatively stable balance of power. Crucially, this is also the period of the most intense spread of Hellenistic cultural language. Art, philosophy, city planning deep into the Near East, Egypt, Persia, Central Asia, even touching India. Hellenism becomes undeniably global.
And the third phase?
From around 220 BC down to 30 BC. This is the age defined by the relentless rise and expansion of Rome. Rome systematically conquers or absorbs the Hellenistic kingdoms one by one. Simultaneously, as we discuss, Rome itself becomes deeply Hellenized.
And 30 BC is the hard endpoint.
Politically, yes. That's the year Octavian annexes Ptolemaic Egypt after defeating Antony and Cleopatra. It marks the final incorporation of the last major independent Hellenistic kingdom into the Roman system. It confirms that Alexander's initial impulse, his creation 300 years earlier, truly defines the entire epoch.
Let's revisit Alexander as Cathachon. That idea of the Caspian Gates wall, it feels very symbolic.
Highly symbolic, but treated by some sources as reflecting a real perceived function of his rule. If the old myths, like Hesiod's Theogony, describe the Titan's primordial chaotic forces being locked away behind bronze walls in Tartarus by Zeus,
Then Alexander building a similar wall
is interpreted as a historical human act mirroring that divine cosmic act of containment. It positions his empire as a necessary bulwark against the eruption of subterranean, chthonic, potentially subhuman forces that threaten cosmic order, forces that inevitably arise when the divine presence withdraws or weakens.
which connects to the idea that the spiritual center was weakening in Greece itself.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that shift to the periphery, Antioch, Alexandria, Pergamum, and eventually Rome, Italy, becoming the vibrant hubs. Mainland Greece becomes something of a historical backwater, losing its grip on the universal meaning it had generated.
So when Rome conquered Greece,
Rome, though militarily young and perhaps culturally rigid compared to the sophisticated Hellenistic East, was already mesmerized. It was conquering a civilization it deeply admired and in many ways felt inferior to, culturally speaking. Rome's military machine became the unwitting delivery system for the very logos Alexander had unleashed.
Let's dive deeper into Polybius again, his philosophy of history, that holistic view, the syntema.
Right, it's not just seeing history as a collection of facts. For Polybius, history is like the internal structure of a single living being. It have an essence, a logos, that is simultaneously revealed and hidden by all the different events and actions, its predicates.
The Dionysian combination of extremes?
Yes. History unfolds through the dynamic interplay of opposites. The historian's job isn't just to record, it's fundamentally philosophical. You have to penetrate the surface chaos, the many, to grasp the underlying unity and meaning, the one.
And this applies to all peoples.
His framework implies that the fate of every nation, every people, inevitably leads them towards participating in the larger imperial project, the drive towards unity, a drive whose template was set by Alexander.
And Polybius himself was involved in major events?
Deeply. He was an Achaean statesman, taken to Rome as a hostage, became close to the Scipionic Circle, and was an eyewitness to the destruction of Carthage in the Third Punic War. His influence stemmed precisely from his clear-eyed analysis of Rome's success and his prediction of the Translatio Imperii.
Transferring the mission of unity from Greeks to Romans.
Correct. And he formulated the crucial idea that this transfer wasn't just fate. It offered a way out of the endless destructive cycle of political decay, the anarchiklosis. A wise ruler, a virtuous state, could potentially counteract that fatal cycle.
By establishing what?
A divine alternative, an eternal empire. An empire based on a just, mixed constitution that could potentially arrest the cycle and achieve lasting stability. This became a cornerstone of Roman imperial ideology.
Let's review that cycle anarchiklosis algorithm again, focusing on the terms.
Okay. Stage 1, monarchy. Simple one-man rule. Stage 2, basileia, ordered kingship for the common good. Stage 3, tyranny, perverted kingship, selfish rule. Stage 4, aristocracy, rule by the best, reacting to tyranny. Stage 5, oligarchy, perverted aristocracy, ruled by the few wealthy. Stage 6, democracy, politia, ruled by the many under law. Stage 7, ochlocracy, perverted democracy, mob rule.
And the eschatological turning point is bottom in ochlocracy.
Yes. Polybius argues that when ochlocracy descends into complete chaos driven by mass greed, envy stoked by demagogues, disregard for law and property, leading to violence and virtual savagery, society hits an absolute nadir. It becomes ungovernable.
And the only way out
Is for the desperate populace, or a faction within it, to turn to a new strong leader, a monarch or autocrat, someone capable of imposing order simply to end the chaos. And thus, the cycle resets, returning to basileia, hopefully. The cyclical engine of political history is precisely what the Byzantine system, founded on the emperor as the kathekon, aimed to permanently halt or transcend.
Now, back to the philosophical battleground. The Cynics and Epicureans as the Cybelian pole.
Yes, the explicit philosophical antithesis to the Platonist Stoic line. The Cynics' radical individualism, their rejection of eidos, form, meant their adherence to physis, nature, was purely about the individual animal self, modeling themselves on the kun, the dog, with a deliberate rejection of the transcendent forms that structure human society, law, and virtue.
And Epicureanism pushed the materialism even further.
To a systematic, almost scientific cosmology designed specifically to eliminate fear of gods, fear of death. Lucretius, Epicurus' great Roman poet-disciple, makes this explicit in De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. Understanding the eternal, material, non-transcendent universe is presented as the cure for religious superstition and existential dread. The source explicitly labels this the philosophical banner of the Titans' revolt.
There was also that geographical note about Epicurus.
Yes, an interesting aside in the source. Epicurus himself was from Samos, an island associated more with Pythagoreanism and Hera. Not Pessinus in Phrygia, a major center of Cybele's ecstatic, often bloody, priesthood. However, the source notes that Epicurus spent considerable time in Lampsacus, on the Hellespont, which was a major center for the cult of Cybele and her consort Attis, suggesting perhaps a geographical proximity, influencing or reflecting his philosophical alignment with the materialist gynecocratic principle. A speculative but intriguing connection.
In contrast, Stoicism offered that synthesis, the immanent logos.
Right, a blend trying to hold Dionysian energy within an Apollonian structure. Its logocentrism, the belief in a rational, immanent order accessible through human reason, was key. The Stoic sage achieves wisdom and virtue by aligning their inner hegemonikon, their ruling reason, with the universal logos.
And this appealed to the Romans.
Perfectly. It provided a philosophical justification for order, duty, cosmic harmony, and rational governance. Importantly, Stoic ontology, while sometimes described as materialist, everything real has body, was complex. It held that everything is material and simultaneously spiritual or rational. Reality requires the act of assent, the syncatathesis of human consciousness, to be fully actualized. This preserved a degree of human freedom and rational agency within the deterministic cosmic framework, making it less radically materialist than Epicureanism and thus more suitable for an empire built on law and civic virtue.
Okay, let's pivot back to Christianity entering this world, the apologetic task.
Huge task. They had to position Christ not as an answer, but the answer, the fulfillment of everything the Hellenistic world, particularly as philosophers, had been searching for.
Justin Martyr's logos strategy was key.
Foundational. By equating Christ with the logos, the reason, the word, already revered by Platonists and Stoics, he claimed the philosophical heritage of Greece for Christianity. His argument about philosophers like Socrates and Heraclitus being Christians before Christ because they followed the sparks, spermatikoi logo of the universal logos, was a masterstroke. It created a continuous history of salvation reaching back through Greek philosophy.
But this required intense philosophical work within Christianity itself, the Trinitarian debates.
Absolutely. The Councils of Nicaea, 325, and Constantinople, 381, weren't just about church politics. They were settling fundamental metaphysical questions using the tools of Greek philosophy. The Cappadocian Fathers were masters of this.
Basil, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzus.
Yes. They had to navigate the complex relationship between Christian revelation and the dominant Alexandrian Platonism, largely shaped by Origen. Their main battle was defining the Trinity against Arianism.
Remind us why Arianism was such a threat to the structure.
Arianism, by making the son logos homoousios of similar substance, rather than the homoousios of the same substance as the viner, effectively made the son a creature, however exalted. For Platonists, creation often involved emanation, Brutus, a gradual stepping down from the source, not necessarily an absolute gap. Some early Christian Platonists, even Eusebius of Caesarea, who advised Constantine, initially hesitated on the Arian question because the idea of the logos as a subordinate emanated principle felt compatible with their philosophical background.
But the Cappadocians insisted on homoousios.
Rigorously. They understood that only if the son logos is fully God, co-eternal and co-equal with the Father, could the ontological bridge between the uncreated Godhead and the created world be absolutely secure. Only a fully divine logos could truly divinize humanity. Their defense of the Nicene Creed cemented this, preserving the integrity of the vertical axis.
And this solidified the Platonic worldview within the empire.
Yes. The orthodox doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation, Christ's two natures, fully God and fully man, effectively embedded a Platonic structure, the primacy of the spiritual over the material, the possibility of assent, the importance of form and reason into the very fabric of mass belief. It affirmed human dignity, capable of union with God, while reinforcing the hierarchical order of the Logos.
And the Catholic ontology developed alongside this.
Under Constantine and Eusebius, yes. And again, the contrast with the Augustinian West is stark. Augustine sees two cities in perpetual conflict. Byzantium envisions symphonia, harmony.
The state as a necessary spiritual entity.
The Christian Roman Empire is the katechon. Its existence is divinely ordained to restrain evil and provide the stable container within which the Church can guide souls to salvation. The emperor, as its apostolos, embodies this function.
Which brings us back to monasticism as the powerhouse, ensuring this ideal wasn't lost.
The akribia, strictness of the monks balancing the oikonomia, leniency, needed for the wider empire. The monastic communities as the living embodiment of the Platonopolis, the guardians maintaining the spiritual fire, pursuing theosis while the empire held the line against chaos.
Let's revisit Plotinus one more time, his vision of assent and the danger of matter as it informed that monastic ideal.
Plotinus's three hypostases. The one, apophatic good, nous, mind, intellect, transcendent Dionysian ecstasy turning to sober self-knowledge. Psyche, soul, immanent Dionysian life rushing downwards, loving nous. It's a ladder of being.
And matter, Heil, at the bottom.
As the principle of non-being, the antithesis of the good, the source of dispersal and death. Contact with matter weakens the soul's connection to form and life.
Porphyry's Cave of the Nymphs illustrates this.
Perfectly. The material world is the cave. Souls descend through the genuine ferny gate of generation, lured by the honey of bodily pleasure.
Honey linked to Cybele, the Great Mother, represents
The intoxicating sweetness of material existence, leading to forgetfulness, amnesia of the soul's true nature, and spiritual death. Associated with the feminine, codic, material principle, gynecocracy. contrasted sharply with Dionysian wine, which grants vertical masculine ecstasy, sobriety, and prophetic insight. The goal is to reject the honey, achieve sobriety, and ascend out of the cave, recognizing the material world as that damp, congealed hallucination.
Did Neoplatonism also have ideas about intermediary beings, like demons?
Yes, they acknowledge different kinds of daimons, agathodaimons, good spirits, perhaps guiding souls, and kakodaimons, evil or lower spirits. Porphyry associated the potentially negative kakodaimons with the West, the autumn equinox, the lower regions of the cosmos, those governing the material world itself. Proximity to matter implied potential corruption.
How did Christianity adapt this?
It essentially solidified the negative definition. Kakodaimons became demons, fallen angels. The positive functions of the agathodaimon were largely transferred to the category of angels within the Christian hierarchy. This reinforced the dichotomy: spirit good, matter dangerous, and potentially demonic.
And Pseudo-Dionysius provided the definitive Christian map of this higher realm.
Yes, his celestial hierarchy, with its 9 angelic orders and 3 triads, fully integrated the Neoplatonic structure of layered mediation between the ultimate Godhead and humanity. It provided the detailed, authoritative spiritual cosmology for the Byzantine world, grounding its vertical orientation.
Looking at the long-term Byzantine civilization, that integration of the feminine through Sophia seems really significant.
The source emphasizes it as a key element of Byzantine stability compared to the West. By venerating holy wisdom, Sophia, and the Theotokos, Byzantine culture found a way to honor and incorporate the feminine principle within the dominant logo structure, rather than simply repressing it as a manifestation of the potentially dangerous Cybelian force.
Avoiding the repression that later led to backlash in the West.
That's the argument. The transfiguration of the feminine into Sophia, into contemplative wisdom, prevented the buildup of pressure that eventually erupted in movements like the cult of reason, seen here as a violent return of the repressed material feminine principle. Byzantium achieved a more balanced, though still firmly vertical, synthesis.
After 1453, the Ottomans take over, but the imperial idea continues.
Yes, the Ottomans inherit the mantle, seeing themselves as successors to Rome-Byzantium alongside their Turkic and Islamic legacies. And Greek cooperation played a role.
The Turkophile sentiment, driven partly by anti-Latin feelings after 1204.
Exactly. Preferring the Sultan's rule, which allowed religious autonomy under the millet system, over the perceived rapacity and intolerance of Western powers. This led to the rise of the Phanariot elite, integrating Greeks into the Ottoman imperial administration.
And the shared symbolism of the marble king and the red apple reinforces this continuity?
Strikingly. The Greek Marmarchimenos Basileus, waiting to return and drive the Turks back to the Kokini Moelia, and the Turkish identification of Constantinople itself as the Kizil Elma, the ultimate imperial prize prophesied for them, both using the red apple, likely derived from Justinian's orb, as the symbol of world empire centered on that single city. They inhabit the same symbolic universe.
Fueling later hopes, like with Cosmas the Aetolian.
Yes, during the Russo-Turkish Wars, the hope for liberation to Pod Helmanon became intense. Cosmas preached that this liberation depended entirely on spiritual renewal, a return to Orthodox Byzantine roots, strengthening the genos from within before the political restoration could occur.
So the entire Byzantine project, spanning over a millennium, was this monumental effort to defend the vertical logos.
To defend the synthesis of Hellenism transfigured by Christianity, maintaining the primacy of the spiritual, the transcendent, the Apollonian-Dionysian axis against the constant undertow of materialism, immanentism, the chaos identified as the logos of Cybele.
Ending with the deep irony of modern Greece's path.
Yes, achieving independence by largely adopting the Western secular, nationalist, materialist paradigms that Byzantium fundamentally opposed. A profound historical reversal.
Which brings us back to that final, unsettling question from the Neoplatonists.
If the material world is just a shadow, a damp, congealed hallucination, how much of our assumed reality is merely the product of a mind that has lost its vertical connection, its ecstatic capacity? Is the true reality still waiting in the realm of ideas, accessible only through that disciplined, upward climb of the nous? It's a question that resonates powerfully from the heart of the Byzantine logos.